September 1940. Major Erwin von Lahausen of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, sat in his Berlin office reviewing reports from agents in the United States. The numbers made him pause. The Americans had just passed something called the Selective Service Act, their first peacetime draft in history. They planned to train 1.2 million men within a year. Von Lahausen underlined the figure, added a question mark, then filed the report, with dozens of others tracking American industrial output, factory construction, shipyard expansion. He'd been watching the United States for 3 years now, and every month the numbers grew larger, the preparations more obvious. But when he brought these reports to his superiors, he encountered the same response. Polite attention, then dismissal. The United States, they assured him, was not a military power, had never been a military power. The American soldier, one general told him, was soft, undisciplined, more interested in movies and jazz than warfare. Their army numbered barely 190,000 men, smaller than Romania's. Yes, they had industry, but industry didn't win wars. Will did. Spirit did. And Americans, everyone knew, had no stomach for real fighting. Von Lahausen returned to his office and kept filing reports no one seemed to read. Across the Atlantic, in a pine forest in central Louisiana, the United States Army was attempting something it had never done before. Camp Polk sprawled across 200,000 acres of cut-over timberland and red clay. Construction crews worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were building a city from nothing. Barracks, mess halls, hospitals, training ranges, obstacle courses, tank trails, airfields. By December, Camp Polk would house 50,000 men. 50,000 men who didn't exist 6 months earlier, wearing uniforms that hadn't been sewn, carrying rifles that hadn't been manufactured, learning to operate tanks and trucks and radios that were still being designed. Private Robert Welch, 19, from Pennsylvania, arrived at Camp Polk in October 1940 with 200 other draftees. They came by train, watching the Louisiana landscape roll past, most of them quiet. Half had never been more than 50 miles from home. A third had never held a rifle. They climbed down at a raw wooden platform, blinking in the heat, and a sergeant told them they had 16 weeks to become soldiers. The first week, they learned to march in formation without tripping over each other. The second week, they fired rifles for the first time, the recoil surprising most of them, the noise making some flinch. By the fourth week, they could field strip a Garand in darkness, dig a foxhole in 20 minutes, read a topographic map. By week 12, they moved through mock villages, clearing buildings, coordinating fire and movement, operating as a unit rather than a collection of individuals. Welch wrote to his mother, "You wouldn't recognize me. I can do 30 push-ups now. We marched 18 miles yesterday with full packs, and I wasn't even the most tired. The food is terrible, but there's a lot of it. And Camp Polk was just one of dozens. Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Fort Benning in Georgia, Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Camp Roberts in California. Each one a small city appearing in months, each one processing thousands of civilians into soldiers. The scale was unprecedented in American history, but it was also, by European standards, almost quaint. The entire United States Army in late 1940 could fit inside a single German army group. The Wehrmacht had 3 million men under arms. The Red Army had 5 million. The Americans were training 50,000 at a time and thought this was ambitious. German intelligence continued to watch. Reports noted the camp construction, the draft calls, the equipment orders. In November 1940, von Lahausen's office estimated the United States could field perhaps 2 million men within 2 years, maybe 3 million if they fully mobilized. This would make them a significant power, certainly, but the war would be over long before then. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Britain was being strangled by U-boats. The Soviet Union, when Germany turned east, would collapse within months. By the time America trained its millions, There would be nothing left to fight for. Then came December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed the American mobilization from ambitious to desperate. Within weeks, the draft calls tripled. Camp Polk, designed for 50,000, began processing 70,000. New camps broke ground every month. The entire infrastructure of American society bent toward a single purpose. Factories that made refrigerators started making machine guns. Automobile plants began producing tanks. Shipyards that built fishing boats laid down destroyer keels. By June 1942, the United States had 4 million men in uniform. By December 1942, 7 million. By June 1943, 9 million. The numbers climbed with a momentum that seemed to have its own gravity, pulling in resources and people and transforming them into military power at a rate no one, not even the Americans themselves, had quite believed possible. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, they were training the 69th Infantry Division, 15,000 men learning to operate as a coordinated fighting force. The division had its own artillery, its own engineers, its own medical units, its own supply chain. It was a small army unto itself, and it was one of dozens being forged simultaneously across the country. The men trained in Louisiana heat, in Georgia rain, and California dust. They fired millions of rounds on practice ranges. They drove thousands of miles in convoy exercises. They learned to coordinate infantry and armor and artillery and air support, to move and fight as a machine with 15,000 moving parts. Lieutenant James Walsh, 23, a platoon leader in the 69th, had been a high school teacher in Ohio 2 years earlier. Now he stood on a training range watching his platoon assault a fortified position using live ammunition, real grenades, actual explosives. The noise was overwhelming. Smoke drifted across the field. His men moved in teams, covering each other, communicating with hand signals, doing everything they'd drilled for months. Half of them had never seen combat. All of them would within a year. Walsh wrote in his diary, "We're not playing anymore. Every exercise now is as close to real as they can make it. Men have died in training accidents. The pace is relentless. But I watch these kids, because that's what they are, kids, and I see them becoming something else, something harder." In Germany, the intelligence reports were becoming impossible to ignore. By mid-1943, the Abwehr estimated American military strength at 9 million men, with projections reaching 12 million by 1945. The numbers seemed impossible. The United States had mobilized a force larger than the entire Wehrmacht in less than 2 years, and unlike German forces, stretched across 3,000 miles of front, from Norway to North Africa to the Russian steppe. The Americans were fresh, fully equipped, and concentrated for a single purpose. Generaloberst Franz Halder, who'd served as chief of the German General Staff until late 1942, later told interrogators that he'd known by mid-1942 the war was unwinnable. The mathematics was simple. Germany was fighting the Soviet Union, which had effectively unlimited manpower, and the United States, which had effectively unlimited industry. Every German tank destroyed was difficult to replace. Every American tank destroyed had 5 more behind it, and 10 more being built. But Hitler wouldn't hear it. In conferences throughout 1942 and 1943, he dismissed reports of American military strength. The Americans, he insisted, were mongrels, a mixed race without fighting spirit. Their equipment was inferior. Their training was rushed. Their soldiers were soft. When generals presented intelligence estimates, Hitler accused them of defeatism. The Americans might have numbers, he conceded, but numbers meant nothing without will, and Americans had no will. Then the Americans arrived in North Africa. Operation Torch, November 1942. 73,000 American troops landing in Morocco and Algeria. The initial performance was mixed. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Rommel inflicted a sharp defeat on American units. German commanders felt vindicated. See, they told each other, the Americans can't fight. But what they didn't see, or didn't want to see, was what came next. The Americans learned, they adapted. They analyzed what went wrong at Kasserine and fixed it. More importantly, they kept coming. Where a German division, once mauled, might spend months refitting, American divisions were replaced within weeks. Fresh troops, fresh equipment, an endless stream of men and material. By May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. 250,000 German and Italian troops marched into captivity. Among them was Colonel Hans Joachim von Arnim, who'd commanded the 5th Panzer Army. In his interrogation, he was asked what surprised him most about fighting the Americans. The abundance, he said, of everything: ammunition, fuel, food, vehicles, spare parts. We were rationing machine gun ammunition. They were firing it like it was free. We were counting shells for our artillery. They were firing 1,000-round barrages, and the men, always more men. You'd destroy a battalion, and 2 more would appear. The interrogator noted that von Arnim seemed more exhausted than bitter, just tired, as if he'd been trying to hold back the ocean with his hands, and finally given up. By June 1944, the United States had 11 million men in uniform. The invasion of Normandy involved 156,000 troops in the initial assault, with millions more waiting in Britain to follow. The scale was beyond anything the Germans had encountered. At Omaha Beach, German defenders inflicted terrible casualties on the first waves, killing thousands. But the Americans kept coming. More boats, more men, more equipment. The beach that was a killing ground at dawn was secured by nightfall, not through tactical brilliance, but through sheer, overwhelming force. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division defending part of the Normandy coast, was captured 2 weeks after D-Day. His division had been considered second-rate, filled with older men and recovered wounded. But they'd fought hard, making the Americans pay for every hedgerow. In his interrogation, Richter was asked if he'd expected to stop the invasion. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. Stop it? With what? We had 6 tanks. 6. The Americans landed with thousands. We had 1 artillery battery. They had battleships. Every time we gathered troops for a counterattack, their planes came. Always planes. The sky was full of them. You couldn't move in daylight. You couldn't supply the front. You couldn't reinforce positions. And the infantry, they just kept coming. Killed 10, 20 more appear. It wasn't a battle. It was mathematics. Back in the United States, the training continued. Camp Shelby, Camp Polk, Fort Benning, dozens of others. Processing new divisions, new replacements, new specialists. By late 1944, the system was so refined it had become almost industrial. A civilian could be drafted, processed, trained, and deployed to Europe in 6 months. The training wasn't gentle. Men died in accidents. The pace broke some. But it produced soldiers by the tens of thousands every month, an endless stream flowing toward Europe and the Pacific. Private Edward Slovik, 24, arrived in France in August 1944 as a replacement in the 28th Infantry Division. He'd been drafted in 1943, trained at Camp Walters in Texas, and shipped to Europe as part of a replacement pool. Slovik was terrified of combat. After 1 day on the line, he deserted. He was caught, court-martialed, and executed by firing squad in January 1945, the only American soldier executed for desertion in the European theater. His death was meant as an example, a message that the Army couldn't tolerate desertion when it needed every man. But the fact that Slovik was the only one executed out of millions deployed suggested something else. The training worked, the system worked. The vast majority of men, despite fear, despite hardship, did their jobs. They weren't supermen. They weren't natural warriors. They were civilians who'd been transformed in a matter of months into functional soldiers. And there were millions of them. By spring 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from east and west, captured German officers began to speak more freely. The interrogation reports from this period are remarkable for their consistency. Over and over, German commanders expressed the same realization: they'd been fighting an opponent they'd fundamentally misunderstood. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht, signed Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945. In his subsequent interrogations, he was asked when he knew Germany would lose. He thought for a long time before answering. 1942, he said finally, when the reports came in about American production. We'd estimated they could build perhaps 15,000 tanks per year. The actual number was 47,000. We thought they might produce 20,000 aircraft. They produced 96,000. Every estimate we made they exceeded by factors of 2, 3, 4. And the men to use all this equipment, they trained them by the millions. We couldn't kill them fast enough. For every American soldier we killed, 2 more arrived. For every tank we destroyed, 5 more appeared. We were fighting arithmetic, and you can't win a war against arithmetic. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, was more blunt in his memoirs. He wrote that German leadership had made a fatal error in assuming American society, being democratic and soft, couldn't mobilize for total war. In fact, the opposite was true. Because American society was democratic, because the people believed in the cause, they mobilized more completely than any dictatorship could force. Every factory, every resource, every citizen bent toward victory. The scale of American mobilization, Speer wrote, was the single most important factor in Germany's defeat. More than Soviet manpower, more than British determination, more than German strategic mistakes, it was American abundance that made defeat inevitable. The final numbers were staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States inducted 16 million men into military service. 16 million. The entire population of Germany in 1939 was 69 million. The United States took nearly a quarter of its military-age male population, trained them, equipped them, and deployed them across 2 oceans. The logistics alone were unprecedented. The training infrastructure created to process these millions, the camps and ranges and schools, represented a mobilization of resources that exceeded the entire military spending of most nations. And the Germans, who'd prided themselves on military efficiency, who'd studied warfare as a science, who'd conquered most of Europe in 2 years, had looked at American society and seen weakness. They'd seen democracy and thought it meant softness. They'd seen abundance and thought it meant decadence. They'd seen diversity and thought it meant division. What they'd failed to see was capacity, the capacity of a wealthy nation to transform its entire economy overnight, the capacity of a free society to mobilize voluntarily with an intensity no dictatorship could match. The capacity of a people who believed they were fighting for something real to endure hardship and sacrifice on a scale that made European observers blink in disbelief. There's a moment in one of the interrogation reports from May 1945 that captures this realization. A German colonel, name redacted, is being questioned about his division's performance in the final battles. The interrogator asks if he'd expected to win. The colonel is silent for almost a minute. Then he says, "Win. We stopped thinking about winning in 1943. After that, we were just trying to survive. Every day, more Americans, more tanks, more planes, more artillery. We'd destroy a battalion and joke that we'd set them back maybe 6 hours, because that's how long it would take for another battalion to arrive. You can't beat that. You can't even slow it down. You can only die trying." The interrogator notes that the colonel seems neither angry nor bitter, just exhausted, hollowed out by the experience of fighting an enemy that never ran out of anything, never ran out of ammunition or fuel or food or men or will. An enemy that absorbed casualties that would have broken any European army and kept attacking, an enemy that learned from mistakes and came back stronger. This was what von Lahausen had tried to warn about in 1940, sitting in his Berlin office, filing reports no one read. The numbers were there, the capacity was there, the will was there. But German leadership, intoxicated by early victories, blinded by ideology, couldn't see it. They looked at America and saw what they wanted to see, a soft, divided nation that would never fight. By the time they realized their mistake, it was far too late. The machine was already running. The camps were full. The factories were at peak production. The ships were crossing the Atlantic in convoys of hundreds. The men were training, millions of them in Louisiana and Mississippi and Georgia and California, learning to march and shoot and coordinate and fight, learning to be soldiers. And they kept coming, wave after wave after wave, until there was nothing left to fight them with and nowhere left to retreat to, and the war was over. In the end, it wasn't brilliance that defeated Germany. It wasn't superior tactics or better generals or more advanced technology. It was scale. It was the ability of the United States to take its vast industrial capacity, its enormous population, its democratic society, and transform all of it into military power at a speed and magnitude that no one, not even the Americans themselves, had quite believed possible.